Oh, so you. Oh wow. So you seem very cultured.
Well, I've spent a lot of time studying like geography and like foreign languages and that sort of thing. That's sort of what I do. And so, yes. But thank you.
Right, right. So because the stereotypical like right winger, if you would call yourself that, you did in Messenger.
Yeah,
The
I don't know. It's hard for me to say exactly what my ideology is, but I am definitely not on the left. I had been, but not anymore.
Right. So it just I don't like going by stereotypes. Like I understand like there are like outliers to the group, but it just seems
Oh
like
yeah,
the
I think that right wingers are more likely to be monolingual, but that's also partially because they're less likely to be immigrants.
well, yeah, well, not even monolingual. Like there are a lot of Cubans who support Trump.
Oh
Actually,
yeah, yeah. The ones in America are usually pretty anti-communist compared to other Latinos.
but you just get the impression. In Ohio, it's very conservative, but the ones around here, they
Yeah,
actually
Ohio's a
are
bit of
not
a
very
swing state.
cultured.
It's sort of you got like a swing state dynamic going in your state.
Yeah, they just don't seem very cultured. They don't really. They seem
Yeah,
somewhat ignorant
I
about.
think rural people are often that way in any culture because they are less likely to live in a city where there are a lot of ideas being spread around, that sort of thing. They're more traditional.
Right, right. So right off the bat, it seems that you are what is the word? It seems like you are a pretty reasonable person. It seems like you well, like you said in chat, it seems like you would be able to change your opinion based on new
Yeah,
evidence.
I think I'm still changing my political views as I learn more things as I get older. I'd say some ideas have changed in the past few years, but I think I've also sort of solidified my views now that I'm like 27 now, so a little bit older. But
Right.
yeah, I think my views have changed a lot in the past 10 or so years, but it wasn't a rapid movement. It's sort of a gradual like thing. Yeah.
Yep. I was a conservative in high school. I was brought up that way. And then
Yeah, I sort of was never very conservative as a teenager. I was definitely very far left wing, like in anarchist groups and that sort of thing. I had a lot of involvement with that, and then I just sort of gradually sort of drifted out of it.
yeah, and then I was briefly involved with like neo Nazis and stuff like
Wow,
that.
that's a big jump because like I made a sort of jump too, where I went from like very far left wing to sort of like I'm not sure how to label my ideology now. It's like I'd say that's with social policies, I'm definitely sort of a moderate. Like I'm not super authoritarian, but I don't believe in like anarchy. With economic policies, I'm definitely pro-capitalist.
Right.
I'm sort of biased with that issue.
Right. It seems well, so like it seems like both of us will agree right off the bat that like socially, so we're both socially libertarian. Esque. It
Yeah, I
seems
think
like economics is where we
like,
disagree.
I make some exceptions. I do make some exceptions, but I think that broadly speaking, the government should stay out of people's business
Right.
as long as they're not hurting anyone.
Yep. Legalize child porn, all that.
Well, that's the thing, though.
No.
If that, I could say that that's hurting someone,
Yeah. Definitely.
right? I mean, like I would say something like child porn is harmful if it's like being manufactured by abusing children. So I would call that a crime, but like a guy choosing to do like recreational cocaine, maybe not a crime.
Yeah. Exactly. Especially because it was specifically used as a tactic by Richard Nixon in the '60s to target blacks, poor whites,
I think
Mexicans.
that Nixon like I think he had many reasons for cocaine prohibition, but also it was sort of like they prohibited alcohol for a long time, and this was giving them a reason to increase police funding. And I think when that was legalized again, they did illegalize weed. So that's probably not a coincidence. I think those police departments in the 30s probably wanted their funding. So I don't think like weed. I don't think it should be illegal. I don't think recreational drugs should be illegal. Maybe, or at least using them shouldn't be illegal. Maybe if you're trafficking like thousands of pounds of meth, that would be forbidden.
Right. So the which is I guess where we talk about our differences. Yeah, I'm definitely pro. It seems like when you look at the countries in the last 100 years that have gotten themselves out of the third world,
Yes.
like gotten out of the third world.
Well, there's
you
a
look
third
at,
world and there's the second world, which is the former communist or current communist countries.
Well, I was talking about if you look at all the countries that have gotten themselves out of relative
Yeah.
poverty, such as Japan.
Well, yeah,
Japan,
Japan, that's a good
used
example.
significant state
Even
intervention.
South Korea used to be quite poor.
Right. Japan got themselves out of severe poverty. They famously had significant state intervention in their markets. South
Yeah,
Korea.
that's true.
South Korea had though they had 5-year plans for decades. You know, they had significant state
Right, but these are
ownership of
both.
the
Maybe
industry.
there's some degree of government regulation, but these are broadly speaking free market economies.
Right. Oh, yeah. Broadly speaking, but when I hear free market advocates talk about, like laissez-faire, personally, I don't know. Though talking to you, I don't think you actually think the free market, like unlimited free market, I don't think that really exists.
Well, I
it's kind
think
of a
that
pipe dream.
I mean, I'm not so ideological about what I think policies should be that I don't think there should be some exceptions, and I think that there needs to be some balance. And so I do think that the government should regulate some things. Like you shouldn't be allowed to do anything you want as a business. There are, I'd say there should be boundaries.
Right. But if you look at all these countries like China, it's 50% public ownership of the economy.
Yes, they have a lot of state-run enterprises in China for sure.
51,000 state-owned enterprises, and
Yes,
it has,
including things like tobacco yeah, definitely.
yeah, it has grown faster than any other country in the modern world. Actually, 28 times over since.
Yeah, they
1978.
really did industrialize very quickly, and for them, I think it began about 40 years ago.
Yeah, in 1978 when Deng Xiaoping liberalized the economy.
Yeah, because this wasn't happening under Chairman Mao. They were kind of going backwards with Chairman Mao. But under Deng Xiaoping, they really built up their industry quite a lot.
Right.
And
Yeah,
they urbanized a lot.
and I think they actually showed. Well, not a lot of the Western communists, but I think a lot of the international communists that I talked to, they really have aligned themselves more with the Deng Xiaoping theory. Like, we open up the
Well,
markets, let the capitalist
I think
industries
that that's
modernize
better
us.
than having Maoism, like just what Mao would have done with his economic policy. But it is still, I would say it's very questionable. Like I'm opposed to this, but I would say it's still an improvement over what Mao had done.
Right, yeah. If you want me to be honest, I think Mao, and I'm going to get a lot of shit from actual communists for this, but I genuinely think that Mao was a little too authoritarian. I think that
Yeah, he's a very extreme example. I actually saw his body, which is weird.
and the mausoleum. I think he just he
Yes,
took things
yes,
a
I
little
went
too
there.
far. Even amongst a lot of communists, he has the how do I want to say it? I don't even know what I want to use.
Yeah, I mean, he killed a lot of people. I mean, it's certainly impossible to predict or to figure out how many people he killed exactly. It was certainly in the tens of millions, but mostly through forced starvation, but also warfare and executions and that sort of thing.
Well, there was a lot of
He-
famines. I mean,
yeah.
I don't think you can
He was-
attribute
he was
the
honestly,
majority.
He was a very skilled military leader, but I don't think he was as skilled or talented at being a politician. He was certainly a skilled military leader. That's something he was very good at.
Yeah, and there were significant benefits under Mao. For instance, one of the things that you don't like about him was Tibet. But actually,
Yeah, I think that if a European country did this, an ethnic minority, the left would be pretty alarmed, I think.
Well, I actually did you know that the Dalai Lama was a I don't know if it was the Dalai Lama. I don't know how old he was then, but the ruling class in Tibet were literal slave owners.
Yeah, I don't believe necessarily that the Dalai Lama himself should be the leader of Tibet. I did see the Dalai Lama speak many years ago because he came to Philadelphia. I watched him speak. But I don't think necessarily they should have a Buddhist theocracy or feudal theocracy, whatever they had. But I do think that Tibetan people should have self-determination and sort of autonomy and not political control from Beijing. And also there's an ethnic element to this because Han Chinese who speak Mandarin will they've now opened a train from Lhasa to the rest of China, and they will sort of colonize Tibet, and they're sort of restricting Tibetan cultural education, including language instruction in schools, that forces you to learn Mandarin, and Buddhist religious instructions also heavily limited, and of course that's not to mention the physical violence against their people.
Well,
I do just think that even if China wants to maintain its socialist system, it should respect the rights of ethnic minorities more. Because if a Western country did this, I think it would shock the left. There would be a lot of outrage, like if America did this to the Navajo or something.
Well, I don't think you can really claim a lot of parity, like, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't think you can really claim a lot of similarities between, what the U.S.
Well,
did to the Navajo.
it's similar. It's a little bit different because,
for example,
Tibetans
the
are actually distantly related to the Chinese. It's very distantly related.
Well, the thing about Tibet was it was actually under what was the dynasty before they became like military dictatorship?
Oh, the Qing dynasty. Yes,
yeah,
yes.
they
Right,
actually
that
broke off in the
was a,
1930s. So couldn't you say like the definition
Well,
of colonial?
honestly, that's the argument that China makes. That's actually a pretty strong argument. I think that if Tibet remains politically part of China, which is actually okay by me, that's fine. Just maybe maybe don't send too many ethnic Han settlers into Tibetan lands. Give the Tibetans some land rights, and maybe give their language more official status. That sort of thing. It seems like they're trying to culturally assimilate them into Han culture, and also it's like they're trying to sort of ethnically cleanse the whole area. And also, there are billions of Han Chinese and only like maybe 10 million Tibetans. Now, the Tibetans, because of the low population density, there may be a majority in many rural areas out west, but the Han Chinese could certainly overwhelm them in numbers.
Right.
They're the largest ethnic group on Earth.
Oh yeah, definitely. But I wouldn't necessarily say that they are I wouldn't call it colonization or anything like that. And I personally, I don't know anything about Tibet. My focus mainly is on the Uyghur situation.
Yes, the
Xinjiang,
Uyghurs. Yes.
Yeah. My thing is my specialty is on that. I would say, even though like I'm not like trained in a university or anything to speak on it.
Yeah,
but just
I've
on the
never
research
been
I've
to
done.
Western China. I think you need to get a separate visa in order to go to Tibet or Xinjiang province. But I did go to China 10 years ago. I went to Beijing, and I talked to Uyghurs in Beijing. Mm-hmm. But because they all the ethnic minorities have a population in Beijing because it's the capital.
Right.
But I know, I think for a white guy trying to get a visa to go to Western China, like Tibet or Xinjiang, is probably impossible because Chinese government does not want foreigners, especially journalists, snooping around.
Well, a lot of white people have gone there. I mean, I've seen videos.
Oh yeah,
of
you
people
can
going.
go there. I'm sure.
Like Vice.
But,
Vice has done it.
I definitely think that you could do it. I got a visa to go to Beijing, but I would need a separate visa to go to Tibet. It's a bit more difficult to get.
Right. There is a like I said, we were talking about the crackdown on Tibet and doing all that. I know the specific reason.
Been doing that for like 60 or so years, maybe longer. Well, what I was saying is, though, you made a good point. You said that Tibet had been politically part of the Qing Empire, the Imperial China. That's true, and that was for a few hundred years. Before that, it was independent on and off. I think the Tibetans, if they want to be a country, should have the right to be. But it doesn't seem unreasonable to include it as part of China, as long as their rights are respected.
Yeah, and like I said, I know more about Xinjiang and all of that. I don't know if there's a radical separatist movement going on in Tibet today.
I think there is, but I don't know how strong it is. I think that there's some pretty serious cultural and ethnic differences there because the Uyghurs are Turkic, and the Tibetans are Sino-Tibetan, and the Tibetans are Buddhist, and the Uyghurs are Muslims, and so I think there is a different religious dynamic, but there's probably a strong Islamist movement in Xinjiang.
Yes. Well, did you know that the Tibetans, there was a significant separatist movement funded by the CIA that was
yes,
stopped
I know
under
about that.
Nixon?
I think when Mao was in charge of China, maybe in the 50s, there was a lot of CIA weapons going to Tibetans. But Tibetans would have, at least the anti-communist factions would have, you could see how you could argue that this is justifiable if you're opposed to communism.
Oh yeah. I mean, when it comes to that, I mean, it's basically ideological. Like, I don't like communism, so we should do this. I like communism, so we should do this.
Exactly.
So,
exactly.
I mean,
it could say it's unreasonable meddling by Americans in Chinese affairs, but if you're viewing it ideologically, you could make a justification for it.
Right. And it is a UN human right, or not a human right. It is a UN right to deny. What is it called? Separatism in any country on earth. China doesn't have to just let Tibet break off. They are protected under international law.
Almost no country wants anyone to secede from them. Sometimes they do, if the area is too expensive. So Suriname was a colony of the Netherlands, and then they had an independence movement, of course, an anti-colonial movement. But the Dutch also wanted to get rid of them because they were losing money. where like once they stopped growing sugar and there's no slavery there, it's not a very profitable place to own. It's just a money pit. And so now it's a very poorly run, poor country. But yeah.
Right. So what all this like brings me back to, I guess, was with talking about radical separatist movements funded by the CIA and all of that. In
Yes,
the 80s,
it's true. There are a few.
In the 80s,
Like even Kosovo.
Oh yeah, Kosovo. And basically every country.
Kosovo is actually a really good example because there is even a NATO military intervention.
And the Saudi prince from Saudi Arabia actually came out and said that the U.S. funded various Wahhabist movements to spread across the Middle East. And
that wouldn't surprise me. I think there's sort of like a real
Cold War.
politic going on where I think that America is playing Saudi Arabia off of Iran to try to limit the power of Iran, which I think is what's going on. I don't think it's really in our actual interests to help Saudi Arabia at all. But I think that our government doesn't actually like them. They're just using them to go after Iran, especially in places like Yemen and Syria.
Oh, oil. Back in the 80s, it was basically.
I think oil has something to do with it. I think oil has something to do with it. Of course.
I think it's
That's
actually a
gotta be
lot
true.
because
But
the
it's
line.
more than just oil. It's certainly geopolitical.
Right. Well, not only that, there's the fact that the U.S. is basically a wartime economy at this point. Well, not a wartime economy, but the only manufacturing that's
very
really
high
increasing.
military spending for sure.
Yeah, the only manufacturing that's really increasing is in the way of arms. So, which is the thing that I criticize about Bernie Sanders and all of that. I don't think they can realistically bring a new industry to the U.S. with what I have seen. Basically, anything that I've seen proposed by the left or the right is just more military spending, which is going to.
I think that like if you're going to justify having that much spending, at least have the money to do it without borrowing money from other countries. Our government's budget is way poorly managed and like very high debt. It's certainly not their money. They're using the people's money. And if the government goes bankrupt and it fucks up the economy, it will be the people who get fucked over by this. But really, both parties are unwilling to cut their spending.
Which is actually part of the reason why we are with Saudi Arabia in the first place. There was actually an oil embargo by Saudi Arabia. I think it was towards Israel. I think it might have been towards the U.S.
Yeah, that
also.
sounds about right.
And then
no one gets along with Israel.
The U.S. struck a deal with them and said we are only going to trade with you in dollars, and you can only trade with the rest of the world in dollars, or something along those lines. I'm not entirely
Yeah, that sounds
sure.
correct. I think that in the past few decades, America has really ramped up production of oil in the United States. So now we are the largest producer of oil in the world. But this is really due to like fracking, which is of course very bad for the environment and you can't it's not sustainable. You're going to eventually run dry, and then you've done all this damage to the earth, but you have to move on. But it has really boosted our oil production. So certainly that's way greater than any imports from the Middle East. We also get a lot of oil from Canada. But I think America is trying to control its own oil supply, sort of maybe for military reasons partially, so it can have enough oil to win a war if it needs to within its own by sourcing within its own borders.
Right. But yeah, so through there was various U.S. funding of radical terrorist groups. There was the Muslim
to some extent,
Brotherhood
but you'll see that also from like Iran. They're funding Hezbollah or whatever.
Well, I'm particularly talking about like the 60s, 70s, like during the Cold War period.
Oh yeah, there was in the 60s and 70s. There was, for example, maybe anti-communist terrorists in Cuba, or like eventually the Contras in Nicaragua.
Well, specifically in the Middle East, there was Egypt. They funded the Muslim Brotherhood.
I think that Egypt was aligned with the Soviet Union at some point with a sort of an Arab nationalist socialist regime. And I think that the Arab-Israeli conflict and like the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, this was to some extent a Cold War proxy war because the Arab countries were aligned with the USSR, which sent disguised airplanes for reconnaissance and also potentially to shoot down Israeli airplanes. It never happened, but I think that was a Cold War proxy war. But America never got involved because this was sort of during the Vietnam era, and I don't think we had the will or the resources.
Yes, but basically, you take all of this. You take, the fact that the Saudi Arabia was basically funded by the U.S. to spread Wahhabist movements across, the Middle East.
Well, I think
They,
the Saudis choose to spread the Wahhabi. We don't like that. We're just trying to use them as a bulwark against Iran, like in a military sense.
Well, yeah, but the U.S. allowed it, though. You know what I mean? They used it
I'll
specifically to
agree with you
thwart the
there. I
Cold.
think that's true.
Like during the
I
Cold
think it's
War.
sort of a shitty policy because I don't think the Wahhabi ideology is helpful to us in any way.
Well, it's specifically for U.S. hegemony.
Well, maybe, but I think
that.
that having extremist religious groups that are connected to terrorism and suicide bombing, that's not good for our people.
But, you take all that, you take them funding Surikat, radical Islam in Indonesia to thwart their socialist leader.
Yeah, they did some communist killing in Indonesia in the 60s for sure. There's a big purge there, I think.
And then, you take all that and you take the fact that, like we have on record, like that CIA agents did say that Wahhabist groups not only gave, radical ideology to various Uyghur sects, but also weaponry.
I think that's true. Also, Xinjiang borders Afghanistan. I'm sure there's some spillover, even though the border's not very large, maybe just a mountain pass. But I think I think the Chinese could justifiably say to some extent that they have the rights to protect themselves from religious fundamentalist terrorists. But I think that a lot of what they've done in Xinjiang sort of is way more draconian than something that would be done on United States soil.
Well, I guess you could say that. That's your opinion. I personally, I guess I don't know 100% of what they are doing. You never know.
Well, it's like in the United States, regardless of who you are, you have Fourth Amendment rights. So the police cannot just search you and arrest you and use the evidence they find in court. They do need probable cause or a search warrant. And if you can prove that they don't have either, the case can be dismissed. There would never be anything like this in China because there's no limitation of the police's ability to search you arbitrarily. So if you're like a foreigner in China, the police know where foreigners go for bars and stuff. And they'll go in with guns, lock the door, make everyone pee in a cup, give you a drug test, and if you test positive for a drug, they deport you from the country. This would be entirely illegal for the police to do in the United States, and so we're not really we're definitely not a police state like them.
Well, we were talking about the what? What I was saying is I don't really know 100% of what is going on in Xinjiang simply because the Western media does lie quite a bit.
Oh, it does.
And exaggerates.
I agree with you there. Also,
exaggerates significantly.
Chinese have made it kind of difficult to know what's going on there because they control internet access and they watch people very closely there. For example, if you're a foreigner, you're a journalist, and you go to that place, anywhere in China, you're a foreigner, you have to have the police called on you to report where you're staying in a hotel. You're not allowed to stay in certain hotels where they don't want foreigners to go. And they can arrest you, detain you even when you're not suspected of a crime. And they'll follow you around when you're in China. Of course they do this. And so if you're a journalist, you can't really interview people or film. And if you do, you'll get arrested.
It's probably because back during the Cold War, Operation Mockingbird, they actually had journalists go into foreign countries.
Yes, I know about that. My friend's actually just bringing it up, but the CIA has done some shady things, of course. But with all these things you're listing, we could go through the things the KGB did, or things that Israeli Mossad has done, or every state has an intelligence agency that does sort of unethical things off the books to try to promote their interests.
I'm aware. Oh yes, but basically what I'm saying is that I don't think that you necessarily can know seriously what is going on in Xinjiang, both.
I think we know some things. Like we have satellite pictures, examples that can tell us how many people are detained, where they are, and what's going on to the extent that we can see.
We actually do not know how many people are being detained. There are some estimates.
No, certainly we don't know that, but we can estimate based on some satellite pictures and sort of.
And most of the estimates are being put forward by pretty shady sources, like the Uyghur Human Rights Congress has put forth 2 million
in favor of Uyghurs, of course.
Yeah, some pretty shady sources, like the Uyghur Human Rights Congress.
But even if the source seems questionable, it could still be true. You'd have to examine it on its own, see if there's evidence.
Well, here we go with the Western propaganda and everything. It was the It was actually funded and started by the NED. Have you ever heard of the NED?
What is that?
The NED, the National Endowment for Democracy. It was started by the United States, and it is significantly funded by the United States.
Well, why would the United States not have a geopolitical interest in containing China and sort of checking China's power, right? Doesn't China do the same thing as well to the United States?
I mean, everything that I have personally seen and heard, and I do significantly research this because, like, that is my preferred economic system. I'm not like a hardcore like Soviet. I mean, maybe in like 3 or 4 decades, I think there needs to be a transition period. But right now, if we were to have like electoralism or revolution, if that were to happen tomorrow in the United States and communists were to take over, we would need some form of market socialism, at least 50% ownership of the means of production, like public ownership, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I do significantly research all of this as much as I can, both sides of the aisle as much as I can, and I do not see them being the aggressor. Everything that I have seen from them personally is for self-defense.
Well, I mean, I can see you making a legitimate argument. There's some degree of self-defense, but what about, for example, building islands in the South China Sea, which are very far away from Chinese mainland, but very close to the Philippines and Malaysia and all that, or Vietnam? Do you think they should be allowed to do that? Because under international law, it's not their waters, it's not their island. It's not recognized as being theirs. It does seem like an aggressive move that they're putting airstrips and aircraft carriers out there, that sort of thing.
Well, yes, I do believe that is for self-defense, simply because...
Well, maybe, but it's international, so are they allowed to... I mean, they're not allowed in international law to do that technically, but they're doing it anyway.
Well, 70% of the oil that is imported into China goes through the South China Sea.
Yeah, of course. It's a very important shipping lane because it goes through the Strait of Malacca, where all the traffic from between Europe and Asia it goes through. But that sounds like China trying to make a grab at this valuable trade route, and that sort of violates the sovereignty of Vietnam and Malaysia, maybe Philippines, and their governments have said this much. The United States doesn't have military or naval bases there. They simply send their ships through international waters as freedom of navigation exercises, which is not the same thing as what China is doing, where they're actually building airstrips and that thing and claiming it as their territory.
Yes, but they do. But the United States can utilize local countries like India. India and China have very hostile relations, so it doesn't necessarily have to be. I think India and the United
States will have an alliance, especially because the Pakistan-India conflict involves China. Like, China and Pakistan are very close allies, and so the United States will then back India.
Yeah, but so I mean the U.S. is sending more. It is significantly sending more ships over there.
Yeah, I think the United States and China are both building up their military presence in the Western Pacific, for sure. Yeah,
yeah,
they have some tensions.
But I would definitely say that is self-defense. Well, not anything.
Well,
I'm not say
I don't know.
anything.
I don't think they have a legitimate case for self-defense. See how far in South China Sea. It's really much closer to Borneo than to China.
Well, because if that gets blocked off, then China loses 70% of oil imports.
Right. They have a strategic reason. Everyone has a strategic reason to claim it, not just for oil, but really for the trade route to go through.
And it should be stated that they are actively trying to explore other options. I don't know if you've heard of the Belt and Road Initiative, but one of the main...
Yes, I see what they're doing. It's sort of like their version of a Marshall Plan, where they want to spend a bunch of money. Like, I think they're loaning a lot of money to African governments to try to bring them into their political sphere of influence. It's almost like a form of neocolonialism, because what they'll do is they'll loan an African country money, and if they can't pay it back, which they never can, then they'll seize a mine or they'll seize a harbor, and they're snapping up all this prime real estate the way Britain or France would have 100 years ago. I think the Africans are very split on this. A lot of them don't like it.
I would significantly disagree with you, but I will get to that in a second. But specifically talking about the South China Sea.
Okay.
CPEC is the major part, or the most invested part by China. What does it stand for? The Pakistan-China Economic Corridor? Yes, yeah, that's what it is. And they're investing billions of dollars into Pakistan so that oil and everything can go directly from Africa, the Middle East, etc.
They're also building like roads and things through the mountains to connect China and Pakistan, for sure, to promote trade.
Yeah, and it'll actually cut out that it's about 12,000 miles to ship something from Africa and the Middle East all the way over to the east coast of China. It'll actually cut it down to 4,000 miles if they just use Pakistan.
Yeah, it seems it's like it's efficient. But what, morally speaking, what does Pakistan do that morally justifies supporting them over the West?
Well, that's the thing.
Pakistan does not seem like a free country or like a country that treats its citizens very well at all. It's not a country that treats women well at all. It's not a country that treats religious minorities well. It doesn't seem like a very it was harboring Osama bin Laden. So there are some bad things about this country.
Oh yeah, yes, definitely. I would not see. My thing is. My basic thing is, and I get a lot of crap from this from communists also. You're probably not going to agree with me, but I personally am somebody who wants self-determination for basically any country. I personally believe that.
I think that you should allow any group that anything that's identifiably a nation, you should allow them to split off and have sovereignty if it's reasonable. Different groups of people should have self-determination, where it's like, if for example, a state in the United States wants to secede in a non-violent way, and the overwhelming majority of their people support this, they should justifiably be able to secede without being attacked.
And that's the good thing about China, really. I have not seen, and like maybe you could find some anecdotal evidence, like they supported some sanctions on North Korea, like in 2018. But I think that was mainly just to ease tensions.
But it seems like North Korea would totally collapse if it weren't for Beijing's support, because they get all their fuel and stuff, and all their international trade goes through China. And all their financial transactions go to China.
Well, yeah, and they can only grow about 20%. Only about 20% of their land can actually hold food. So they're basically
North Korea is very mountainous, cold, and it's not as fertile. It doesn't have as much arable land as South Korea. But at the same time, North Korea is not manufacturing valuable goods and services and then exporting them and then importing food. It's just unable to feed itself.
Well, yeah. A lot of that is the fact that it has literally but aside from Cuba, it has the worst sanctions on it in the entire world.
Yeah, understandable.
And it does have trillions. It has trillions
when we talk about.
It has trillions of dollars in rare minerals. Actually, in those mountains.
Why is it that there are food shortages in every communist country? In communist China in the 50s, there were famines that killed tens of millions of people. In Soviet Union in the 30s, there was a famine that killed tens of millions of people. And there's a famine in Russia in the 20s. And this was before the economic sanctions against Soviet Union or China.
Okay, when did you say that the famines were in China?
Well, there was. I suppose there was very little trade going on between the West and China. But
when specifically was the?
There was the Great Famine in like the late 50s in China, maybe during the Great Leap Forward time.
All right, so I don't know if you know much about China before it had the revolution.
Yes, I do indeed.
Okay, I figured you would because you've talked to some Chinese people. It's
I
significantly unindustrialized. A large portion of the people couldn't even read or write, let alone doctors, medical care,
they were
engineers, anything like that.
They had
suffered
like 50 years of war, so they were really set back.
Yeah, they had famines for centuries. Actually, they had famines for centuries. And I don't necessarily think that you can say it's communism's fault because, 10 years...
we can say it's communism's fault because what caused the famine was the process of collectivization. And it didn't help that the government ordered them to kill all the sparrows, which were important for eating insects that would eat the crops.
Yes, that was definitely a policy error, which is one of the things
it's one policy error. The collectivization itself caused the food supply to collapse, and the government had essentially planned an economy which shifted workers and resources away from food production and towards heavy industry like steel production. And this was also done in the Soviet Union, and it had the same effect of causing mass starvation. And another thing, in places like Soviet Union, in Ukraine, and also in communist China, they would go and take all of the grain from the peasants and kill anyone who wouldn't give up grain. And this killed, I don't know, maybe 10 million in Ukraine. And I can't even estimate what it would be in China. Maybe 40, 50 million. Who knows?
Those are some
At
pretty
a certain point, you can't
significantly
even count the
inflated.
Dead.
Those are some pretty significantly inflated numbers for the Ukraine.
Okay, well they're not. They're not. Remember, China had probably 500 people at that time.
No. I mean, like 10 million people from the Ukraine died because of the famine.
Oh, maybe there were 10 million people in the entire Soviet, mostly in Ukraine and Kazakhstan.
Well, that number specifically comes from the Black Book of Communism, which the editors of it
Well,
actually.
you can say that the source is not true, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. You just denying that it's true doesn't mean it didn't happen. Of course, it happened.
Well, I don't disagree that there was a famine in the USSR, and various historians like Mark Togger, Grover, Arch Getty, several of them actually say that there was a famine. That can't be disputed.
Yeah, I agree. There was
However,
a famine, but also there are food shortages in almost every communist country that's ever existed.
yes, because there's never been a rich country that has had a revolution. What I was trying to get to with China was you say that it was because of collectivization. However,
Yes, I think so.
You take the fact that they had virtually no infrastructure, not even doctors. Most of the people couldn't even have medical care. You probably heard of the barefoot doctors in China. And then you take the fact that they had centuries, like literal centuries of famines, and you think that they can.
Right, but they didn't have famines as bad. And also, why is the famine necessary?
They had some pretty
to solve
bad
this
famines.
problem?
They had some pretty bad
Right.
famines.
But that doesn't really matter, though, because this policy caused the famine. And it was really the worst famine in human history.
Did it cause the famine, or did it just exacerbate it?
Well, I won't say there were no natural, like, weather reasons, precipitation reasons, maybe why the famines happened. But when you're in a situation where all private property is banned and all food is the property of the state, you do not get the rice that you produce, and so you don't have any incentive to work any harder than you need to be given your daily quota for food, for rice. And so people don't put in much effort, but when the amount of rice or money that you get depends on how hard you work, it produces more effort. So when China finally increased its food production and made it so that everyone could afford food, everyone could have food, they did this after Chairman Mao, after the Cultural Revolution, by the late 1970s, early 1980s, because they created a system where you would be rewarded for working hard instead of having the government just seize everything. So they've implemented a sort of somewhat of a free market. For example, they allow pets to sell surplus vegetables they have sometimes.
I would definitely not call the Deng era a free market.
Well, it's not free market. It's a socialist regime, but it's allowing something similar to a market, because there is you're allowed to sell whatever surplus good you produce. So, for example, like I know a Chinese guy who's like a student, and his grandfather spent 11 or maybe 13 years in a labor camp, in a slave labor camp, because he was arrested for selling duck meat during the Cultural Revolution in the 60s. So, I mean, maybe I know communism wants to ban all private property, but I fail to see how it's appropriate punishment for a man selling duck meat to survive during a time of famine. And the appropriate punishment is to put him in slave labor for 13 years. That's really, I don't see how anyone could think that's a good system.
Well, okay, so I don't really believe that you can say that communism or socialism or collectivization or anything necessarily caused the famine, simply because I do not think that a country with a history of famines and a very uneducated populace could not logistically, train its citizens, educate them, provide them literacy, and then put them through 4 or 5 years of engineering school.
Communism caused a famine in Ethiopia in like 1984? I mean, I think that was partially natural disaster. But don't you think that they had a communist revolution, and they had many wars going on with Eritrea and that sort of thing, and they had this communist government, the Derg, in control? It was a dictatorship, and they seized all the grain for themselves. Like Derg in Ethiopia, they would take the food from the peasants, eat it themselves, and many people died. That seems like a very unequal system, and also a very violent one. So we see the same pattern in almost every communist country, where there are food shortages in all of them. So that's why I believe that's sort of something inherent to the system. And the reason why I believe this is because prices in a communist country are not determined by supply and demand. They're determined by the government. So the price of an item does not reflect its true value in the market. It could be lower, it could be higher. But
true value is a pretty subjective term, and they subjectively come up with their own prices via the labor theory of value.
Exactly. But the problem with this, though, is that when you set prices to whatever you want rather than to what supply and demand determines,
But capitalists do that.
You get shortages of things you need, and you get surpluses of things you don't need, because the price, when it's based on supply and demand, it's a signal that communicates information collected from millions of people who aren't talking to each other. But that price gives you information about, like if it's coffee, for example, it gives you information about the bean supply, the price of labor. And so if you're a manufacturer, price of coffee goes up, you might switch to manufacturing more coffee to make more money. Price of coffee goes back down, you manufacture less. A consumer might switch from drinking coffee to tea if the price of one goes up. But in a communist country, a state-run enterprise isn't given those market signals because they don't know how much value anything has, so they might be producing an item at a loss for 20 years until they're bankrupt.
Yes.
Whereas in a free market economy, they would shift to producing something else. They would use that capital to produce something else.
Well, okay. So first of all, capitalists plan their pricing. In capitalism, it is based on. It's not based necessarily on supply and demand all the time. A lot of it is actually planned. They come up with complex mathematical equations. They come up with complex mathematical equations specifically to plan out the economy. What is the difference between that and socialism, you might ask? In capitalism, the economy is directed towards the accumulation of profit. In socialism, it is geared towards, what do the people need? The necessities of humanity.
Right, but here's the thing, though. You made a good point there. What do the people need and making profit. Here's the thing. Profit and loss are signals that tell a manufacturer what to do and what not to do. So, for example, in January, I said to my father, why don't I spend $1,000 on toilet paper? And he said, well, why? I said, because I can keep it for 40 years and resell it if I can and maybe make some money. And then I didn't buy toilet paper. But then in this pandemic, the price has gone way up. So that's a signal, tells people, hey, make more toilet paper, we need more of it. If you set the price of toilet paper to be very low, well, the real value is actually higher based on supply and demand. So it will fly off of the store shelves. People know intuitively that's worth more than the market price. The problem is, though, if the prices don't reflect supply and demand, you won't know how much or how little to produce to avoid shortages or surplus, because if the price you set is lower than the actual value, people will all buy it up immediately. There will be a shortage. If the price is too high, the opposite happens. You get too much of something, and you're producing too much of it. But like in capitalism, for example,
or you could just
don't have a shortage of diamonds.
Or you could just set a fixed. Excuse me. Or you could just set a fixed price and just have like basic rationing, like Walmart is doing.
I suppose you could, but
you might not like Cuba.
You're rationing it.
You might not like Cuba.
How much produces by the whole economy.
You might not like Cuba. I don't know what your opinion is on Cuba. However, one thing that you cannot deny, it is, you can say whatever you want about it. The economy is shit, whatever. But every man, woman, and child is guaranteed a home in Cuba. Every man, woman, and child is guaranteed.
Let me examine this.
Are you allowed
to choose where you want to live? Not really. You have to ask permission from the governments. They have less housing rights than we do in the United States.
Do you have proof that? Do you have proof that they cannot choose where to go?
Well, of course, everything in Cuba is controlled by the states. It's not controlled by the state of the United States. You're free.
I would not.
States to pack up.
I would not say that.
They are go to a different city if you want to, right?
They have significantly
Soviet
liberalized
Union or in
their
China,
economy.
they have internal passport systems which limit where you're allowed to live and work. And because the government provides housing, you do have to ask permission to live in a certain place. They're going to allocate it to you based on, I don't know. But another problem with Cuba is that look at how poor they are compared to the average American.
Ignoring the fact that the American embargo on them has costed their economy $130 billion.
Well, I agree, but
they were just embargoed by the biggest economy on earth. But it's probably socialism.
Right, but we see this in every communist country, though, and even with the Soviet Union,
every economy has been embargoed by the United States, though.
Okay, fine, but don't
you think that
Cuba's GDP,
let's examine
GDP would be equal?
Let's examine the world post World War II. Basically all of Europe is destroyed. Latin America and Africa have been destroyed by centuries of colonialism. And the one economy that's still standing, the United States and Canada.
That's true. Canada. Soviet Union.
They made up more than 25% of the global GDP, and then they say, hey, all these economies that just socialized, we're going to embargo them. Of course, they're going to be like repressed in some way,
Right, but
shape,
it's
or form.
like,
They're gonna
I
have
think the
negative
problem
effects.
is, though, how can I falsify your position? If I say to you that, how can that be falsified? If you're blaming their lack of food and lack of wealth on embargo, how could we falsify that?
Oh, no, I am blaming their lack of food when they had lack of food on the fact that their economies were not fully industrialized yet.
Well,
as in the Soviet
didn't the
Union,
communist countries
you
buy-
mentioned the famine in Ukraine that happened in the 30s. However, when did they come? Ukraine. The Ukraine actually joined the Soviet Union.
Yes.
In the
been
20s,
much
so they only
longer.
had about 10 years, and their economy was completely unindustrialized. It was basically just a shitty
they were,
feudalist
they're
economy
still the breadbasket of Europe to a large extent. They
with
have a
barely,
lot of grain production.
with barely any infrastructure to its name. But the Soviet Union tried its best to significantly
The
invest
Soviet Union
millions.
exported grain for years when the Ukrainian peasants were dying, and the Soviet Union took this grain from the peasants to export during the famine.
Yes, because that is the only thing that the West wanted from them. They were trying to industrialize their economy, and we
Well,
now know
the West did not
and-
know that they were
and-
starving the Ukrainians. The New York
and
Times
we now-
went to Russia, and it didn't report on
And
it.
we now know that that is good. It's good that they did
But
that.
you
because 10
agreed
years
that
later,
they seized grain while millions of people were starving, and they exported it.
yes, and now we know that they are on the right side of history for that. What happened
But
10
don't
years
you
later?
think that murdering millions of people is similar to what the Germans did? I mean, maybe they did it for racial reasons, but when is forced starvation acceptable to do to a human being? Like, if you're going
it's
to
not-
kill millions of innocent people by stealing their food,
Oh, that's the
what
thing.
greater cause justifies that?
Avoiding the Nazis from invading your country and completely
Well,
wiping out
if
all
the
the
Nazis
Slavs.
kill the same, like if the Nazis kill your people and that's what you're afraid of, why kill your own people to prevent the Nazis from doing it? That doesn't seem very logical.
Oh, they didn't kill their own people. I mean,
Well, they
it was a
exported the
natural.
grain when they were.
It was a
starving.
natural famine. Like I don't want to.
Well, sure, but it could be called like, okay, the weather's natural, but the collectivization and taking the grain is really taking the grain. It's requisitions. That's not natural.
Okay, so all right. I mean, I could concede that point and say that the USSR maybe killed those people. If you want to say that the socialism killed those people, are you prepared to accept that Britain killed billions or not billions?
Well, they did it to the Irish. Sure, I blame the British for that.
Oh, not only that, India.
Yeah.
India
Yeah, oh, yes,
alone
of
was
course. But here's
colonized
the thing,
200
I don't
years.
think that,
Was
I
colonized
don't think
200
that the
years
British
by
doing something.
Britain, and some people
I don't
say that
think
45
no, you
trillion.
make a good point there, but I think that if Britain does something bad and the Soviet Union does something bad as well, but they kill more people, neither one is good. Just because the other one does it doesn't mean it's okay for the other one. Both are.
That's where we get into the difference between capitalist authoritarianism and socialist authoritarianism.
Right, exactly, because
capitalism,
there is a difference. But
capitalist
they're both
authoritarian.
They both, yeah.
And that goes back to basic Marxist-Leninist ideology. Okay, so back, you might have heard of the Paris Commune, where
Yes,
a bunch
of course.
anarchists
After the
and
Prussian
communists.
Invasion.
Yes, the Paris
Like
Commune.
1870 or so?
It's something like that. And so basically what happened was they said, okay, we are going to bring libertarian socialism to Paris. We are going to wipe out the monarchy.
Yeah, this
and
was one of the early experiments in, like, it's actually a pretty early example of, like, revolutionary socialism.
Yes, and so they did not worry about destroying the capitalists or the feudal monarchy. What they did was they just basically sat around Paris for a bit, and about 30 days later, I believe it was Napoleon or whoever the leader was, came in and destroyed them.
Yes, I remember that. Well, then again, remember, imagine if you're the leader of France, they're occupying your capital city, you've just been invaded by Germany, so they're trying to reassert their control of their country.
Yes, and I do not fault them for that. But what I am trying to say is capitalism as a system is going to attempt to defend itself.
Yes, of course, and really
Marx
any
called
government
itself-
has an incentive to...
Marx called it the dictatorship of capital. And what he advocated for is the dictatorship of the proletariat. He said
Well,
that
here's the thing, I
capitalism
don't
is
think we
naturally
need
going to be
choose between two
authoritarian.
dictatorships. We can choose a free country that's not a dictatorship.
Capitalism
People
is
have
naturally
rights.
an authoritarian ideology, and we have seen that.
It can be authoritarian, but it depends on how they go.
It 100% has to be
having a free market
authoritarian.
is just having economic freedom. It doesn't require a state. It doesn't require authoritarian anything.
Capitalism 100% has to be authoritarianism in order to survive. And
Well, then what about like the libertarian right, like Milton Friedman? He was very much very small government advocate. You know, he didn't believe in having the government do much at all. He sort of wanted a night watchman state, like he wanted to get rid of the Federal Reserve even. He didn't even want government.
I do not deny that. I do not deny that there have been advocates for free market capitalism. I definitely agree with that.
When you look
However,
at like Austrian economics and people on the libertarian right, they're very much anti-authoritarian.
Yes,
they promote free markets.
Yes, however, and they might do that to the economy to an extent, but when it comes time to like not cooing innocent countries or not invading and killing millions of innocent people, it just seems that they cannot do that.
I think that like the CIA is kind of like more of a authoritarian right government, although America, because it's a constitutional country where there's rule of law and it's not a single party dictatorship, like it's not the same as like a more authoritarian country. But I think the CIA could be considered authoritarian, whereas Friedman and like Friedrich Hayek, these are just economists, and they're not going to they really didn't write about foreign policy. They're writing about things like monetary.
Well, the only reason that it never got completely authoritarian in the United States, I would argue that it did get extremely authoritarian. They banned communists from voting, significant repression of the press through Operation Mockingbird and lying through the press.
Well, compare that to the press control in China now. I mean, they don't have freedom of information there.
Yes, and that all goes back to the central argument that I am proposing. Capitalism is a natural ideology, whether you think a naturally authoritarian ideology, whether you think
you're saying that
it is
what
impossible.
About the libertarian right? You agree that there are libertarian socialists, like perhaps there are like anarcho-syndicalists, for example, and then there are democratic socialists, and then there are Stalinists. But on the right wing, there's the same type of spectrum. So you have like someone who would want like an actual like a fascist regime or a military dictatorship. Although a lot of fascist regimes are actually sort of third position economically. They have elements of a planned economy and capitalism, just with extreme authoritarian system.
I wouldn't say they're third position. I mean, if you look at
the fascists are not Marxists. They're not Marxists, but they do promote the form of socialism that's nationalization of the economy, but it's not Marxist.
Yeah, even a lot of them significantly privatized various industries, their entire economies.
Of course,
basically.
but they
Hitler privatized the shipyards, railroads,
like
banks.
for example,
Pinochet was widely renowned for bringing the first neoliberal economy to the world.
Well, Hitler, he called the party National Socialist, maybe to steal votes from Social Democrat parties, but after the
and
first
then murdered
year
all the
of Hitler's
leftists in the
regime,
party.
He decided that he would nationalize a lot of the coal production. That was done, and this was really done for war production reasons. And they also made it so that the government would subsidize synthetic oil production because it was deemed, even though it was extreme, so they nationalized this production, and the government subsidized it, and they're really losing a lot of money by inefficiently producing oil from coal instead of importing it from Romania. But the Germans deemed it very crucial, so they nationalized this industry. But then during World War II, it wasn't enough oil anyway, so they were always having oil shortages.
And then they tried to attack like various parts of the Soviet Union to get more oil. But
yes,
how is that?
The Caucasus, but that was on their far southern flank, and they couldn't hold on to that.
I mean, yeah, but that sounds like basic Keynesianism, wouldn't you agree? Like they're basic Keynesianist countries.
No. Keynesian economics is what Keynesian economics is like what the United States and Britain would do, even now. And like,
I do not think
Keynesianism because I don't really agree with it.
I do not think that the United States could be classified as Keynesian. I'm talking more of the social democratic states. Norway and Denmark have state-owned oil companies. I don't necessarily think you can call that
Western
socialist.
Countries could be broadly considered to be Keynesian. That's sort of like the typical macroeconomics you will learn in a university. It's sort of like the dogma of the West now. Like Richard Nixon said, we're all Keynesians now. So this is true of both like George Bush and Barack Obama. They both support sort of like Keynesian intervention in the economies. They both do this.
Yes, but that basically brings my point around back to the, maybe you can say that, sure, there are some people who advocate for a free market economy in capitalist countries. However, if we have not seen that for the last 300 years, the entire existence of capitalism from major capitalist countries, for 300 years, there's constant like enslaving, cooing democratically elected governments, invading.
I can answer that. Let's see if I can answer that. So there is Keynesian economics, which I think for the past 100 years has really been the status quo in the West. I'm
sorry. I don't mean to interrupt you, but I think if I ask you this question, it'll make it much clearer for me, and maybe you could answer it. So at one point, if you find that no socialist country have ever worked, you might say, okay, well, like socialism definitely doesn't work. If you find Britain kills like basically 1 billion people in India through starvation, and Iran, Ireland, etc., etc. Basically every capitalist country, the U.S., Nazi Germany, whatever country, eventually. Yeah, if you can't find a single one, like a major power that does not resort to just like murdering innocent people, like cooing democratically elected governments.
Well, maybe this is just something inherent to governments. Maybe just some governments are less murderous than others. But can't both left-wing and right-wing governments.
Yes, how you could say that's an aspect of some governments, but like when the major superpowers of capitalism have just resorted to just basic authoritarianism, which
I don't think the United States is as rapacious as the communists of the 20th century. Now, in the early part of the United States,
that's because
especially with British colony and all that, there were some very brutal things going on. But then again, this is happening all over the world in the 1600s, including in Russia. In Russia, Tsarist Russia, they'd execute you by pouring molten lead down your throat and shit. So, it was brutal times in the United States and Europe during that time. But during the 20th century, there were some pretty nasty things going on in America, like segregation and like KKK and that sort of thing. But we don't have, like, for example, between 1975 and 1979, perhaps 20 to 25% of Cambodia's population died or murdered.
Cambodia wasn't communist,
but also through just plain murder. So they have like something like 30,000 mass graves.
Well, Cambodia wasn't even communist.
Well, that's what a lot of communists will say when they give exampes of. That's not true Scotsman to me, because they followed a communist ideology. Now, they completely abolished their currency, and they were completely reliant on the dollar.
But it was found out decades. It was found out decades later that the U.S. funded Pol Pot for 15 years.
Right, I know that. I know
so
that.
I don't really think
like
when
countries do things like intelligence, like CIA or KGB. They don't fund people they're ideologically allied with. They fund people who are enemies of their enemies. The United States did this
with China,
to keep Vietnam from expanding. But we
actually did this with China against the Soviet Union.
Their primary benefactor in Khmer Rouge was communist China.
Even though communist China supported the Kampuchea, I don't know what it's called, but the Cambodia government.
The American government supported the Cambodian government, but then it was destroyed after 1975. And this is admittedly to a large extent because the United States bombed the hell out of Southeast Asia, which destabilized everything. But Cambodia was aligned with China. Vietnam was aligned with the Soviet Union. This is during the Sino-Soviet split. And so China and Soviet Union had a falling out diplomatically. Khmer people and Vietnamese people already have very deep ethnic tensions. And so that's a reason why they had conflict. Mm-hmm. So certainly Cambodia was not friendly with all other communist countries. But it is an example of a communist country.
I wouldn't say it necessarily is, simply because it rejected the basic tendencies of Marxism.
Well, there was a schism. Maybe you're more of a supporter of the Soviet Union and not Cambodia. I think that the reason why the United States wanted Cambodia to have Khmer Rouge to have Cambodia's UN seat is only because Khmer Rouge had no more real power in the 1980s after the Vietnamese invaded. So the UN seat was meaningless, but it would prevent the Soviet Union from gaining another voting seat. The United States is trying to prevent communism from spreading in general.
Okay. No, but what I was trying to, the question that I was trying to allude to earlier is, okay, so if you have like 300 years of authoritarianism from superpowers under capitalism, if that were to be, under socialism, you'd say, okay, socialism obviously doesn't work.
Well, how long do we, how many times do we try
I'm sorry, just let me finish real quick.
Sure, my bad.
No problem. At one point, as a libertarian capitalist, would you say, okay, we've had 300 years of authoritarianism, and it's still going on. It doesn't really seem to have decreased.
Well, I think that
at one point, do you say that maybe it doesn't work?
No, I do actually agree with you somewhat. I think that we can look at the mistakes that Western countries have made in the past 300 years with their economic system, and we can make reforms. I don't think Marxism should be one of them, but there are lots of changes we can make to change our political system, of course.
Like what?
That's actually a good point you've made. But I think that how long do we need to observe Marxist-Leninism in different countries? It's been since 100 years ago. How long do we need to observe them before we can conclusively say, okay, this has this effect, this has that effect? Like, I think there are some observations we can make.
China,
macroeconomic,
Vietnam, Laos, they're all Marxist-Leninist countries that they might not be 100% planned economies, but they are Marxist-Leninist countries that have significant economic planning, and they have undergone the biggest transformation in the 20th century.
I think
the New York Times literally
since
called
the collapse of the Soviet Union 30 years ago, global poverty has been roughly cut in half, and it's mostly in places like Africa and India. And so at a time when
going by the World Bank statistic, which is like
China
$2
as well,
a day.
you had very strong. I will say that China has had a lot of economic growth, but I'd say for the past 30 years, poverty has been consistently declining at a time when the United States influence has increased and Soviet influence has decreased, and it's gone, in fact.
However, if you look at the former Soviet, I would contest that by saying if you look at the former Soviet countries, poverty is actually increasing in many of these countries.
Right, but you could
they're literally calling.
Because, I would argue that
they're
that's
literally
because
calling
they had
Albania, Bulgaria. They literally call Bulgaria the Great Shrinking Nation because people are fleeing from their country so quickly.
The birth rates are very low in these. That could be one reason why. It's also true for Italy, and Japan, which are not communist, and so it could have. That's true. But another thing is that the economic decline in Eastern Europe after communism, you can blame on communism because Marxism-Leninism is a system until 1989 in most countries, or 91 in the Soviet Union. But what happened was all these state-run industries in the Soviet Union were woefully inefficient because, like I said before, prices didn't reflect real value. And there's no inflation either. All the prices were set. Because the prices don't reflect real value, they produced a lot of, I think they had an economic collapse in the mid-'80s. Or even before then, really by Leonid Brezhnev's time in the Soviet Union in the 70s and early 80s, that's when their economic decline began. So it's certainly, yeah.
I'm trying to find this article real quick. I don't know.
Well, I think there could be some points we could make about, I think there are many good points we can make about things the United States does wrong or has done wrong. So slavery is a really good example. The American Civil War is a really good example. That should have been avoided. That was a huge waste of human life. That was a mistake. It's almost like a political flaw in our system. But so the United States has made many mistakes, but we can't use them to justify the existence of communism. We have to look at communism and see, do ordinary people have a better life? Maybe some people do, but I would argue that if the government can arrest you and search you without any suspicion of a crime, and there's no court that's not controlled by a political party, there are no elections, you have no property rights, you have no freedom of religion, you have no freedom of speech, you have no freedom of assembly. It seems like Russia was like a prison the size of a fifth of the earth,
I think you're being a little extreme with the prison.
Well, no, it is like a prison because you need permission from the government to do anything in Russia, even to get a car, or even to live in a city. They tell you which cities you're allowed to live in. And in America, while America has many inequalities, it certainly allows it to have a lot of personal freedom.
Yeah, personal freedom for the United States, but they don't really care about that when they're backing like Saudi Arabia or funding coups against democratic.
Then again, Saudi Arabia, maybe we could argue that Saudi Arabia should have a secular constitutional system like us instead of a theocratic Islamist monarchy. So we can blame. I blame Saudi Arabia on essentially political Islam and the ideas behind monarchy.
But the United States
supporting them.
But how can you say that
supporting them for its own realpolitik interests?
Yes, but you blame Saudi Arabia for.
Would do.
Yes, but you blame Saudi Arabia because of radical Islam.
Right.
But the United States literally funded radical Islam and propped it up as like the example of Islam around the world. I mean, like I said, they funded radical Islam, Shariat Islam in Indonesia.
I'm on board with you there. I think we should actually re-examine our relationship with Saudi Arabia. I'm sure you remember in late 2018, it was found that in Turkey, the Saudis murdered a journalist who had been maybe an American. This was a big diplomatic incident, but I think what's going on is that our government here is supporting Saudi Arabia in an attempt to keep Iran in check because they're judging Iran to be the bigger threat to us. So it's not that we even like Saudi Arabia. It's sort of that it's sort of a Machiavellian move, right? But this is also the sort of behavior that the Soviet Union or Britain would do. This is just sort of how states behave in international relations. They support policies that promote their geopolitical power, not necessarily their ideology as much.
Yeah, and that all comes down to power.
Yeah, of course.
With the dictatorship of the proletariat,
communist countries and capitalist countries.
The dictatorship of the proletariat and dictatorship of capital. What I was saying earlier. The only reason that these countries in socialism resort to authoritarianism is because capitalist countries will literally use even more authoritarian methods.
Well,
to overthrow them.
In the United States, we've never had a system in communist China or Soviet Union. It's certainly a level of totalitarianism.
Yes, because there was never a legitimate threat against the United States.
I'm wondering, what do you think about the Soviet Union or China is desirable in their system?
Well, I would like to contest this point real quick.
Sure.
The reason that we have never had a level of authoritarian, we have had significant levels of authoritarianism by the United States.
Especially in the 20th century, it's been a bit more lenient. Especially, you can't compare us to
as soon as the 50s came around, Richard Nixon, no, it was Eisenhower, made it illegal for communists to vote.
Right, but
I cannot vote.
That's barely anything. Look at this. Look at the degree of what the secret police would do. Places like East Germany,
and then they would shut down.
Romania.
And then they would shut down journalist freedom in the United States too via Operation Mockingbird.
Do you think that?
Anything
the United States does justifies what Soviets do?
Hold on. And then at one point, they literally thought about Operation Northwood, I believe it is. They literally thought about faking terrorist attacks and then blaming it on Cuba to ignite a war.
You know that during the 1980 Olympics, during the 1984 Olympics, I think this was the United States. So I believe that during 1980, the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan the year prior, and Jimmy Carter said that the United States would boycott the Olympics in 1980 because they were in Moscow, I think. Right. And so in retaliation, the Soviet Union wanted to fuck up the United States when they were hosting the Olympics in 1984. So the KGB sent out forged letters to many African and Asian countries pretending to be the Ku Klux Klan, where they threatened these African countries in order to give the impression that the United States is a dangerous and racist and hostile place. This was revealed to be.
Are you really saying in the 80s that the U.S. wasn't a dangerous, hostile place to black people?
Well, you can't just be like too quoque, because I'm not arguing that the United States didn't do unsavory things.
I would definitely need a source to prove that. I have never heard that before.
I forget where it's from, but you could Google it. The KGB did many things. Like, for example, they funded the anti-war movement during the Vietnam War. That's pretty obvious. That's not that. See, the Soviet Union did lots of. It's called active measures, where it's like I think maybe 90% of their intelligence budget was spent on subversion, and 10% was actual real espionage, where they're sneaking into military bases and photographing things. But I think people have a very stupid James Bond view of how spying works, but actually a lot of what Soviets would do is not really that interesting. A lot of it was they would get a KGB agent to make a network of labor union leaders or journalists or university officials, and they'd make sure that they were loyal communists, so they could subvert the ideology of the United States, maybe so that in 20, 30 years' time, push it in a Marxist direction. And they didn't just do this to the United States. They did this to really any country. So France, India, and the United States at the same time did the exact same thing.
Well, yeah, but this all goes back to the power struggle. I mean, as soon as capitalist countries come under threat, they immediately become authoritarian. I mean, if you look at Nazi, we'll use Nazi Germany as an example.
You can say this about any authoritarian country, regardless of economic. Any authoritarian country tries to defend its political power at all costs, because I think world politics, international relations, it is a zero-sum game, and it's based on how strong you are relative to other states. It doesn't matter what your absolute power is. It matters how strong you are relative to other states.
Yeah. Okay. We'll use Nazi Germany as an example. The number one party in Nazi Germany or in Germany. Prior to the Nazis taking over, prior to Hitler's election, were the Nazis. The number two party was the Communist Party. You know, they had decades,
they had Weimar Germany.
Basically
there had
a century
been
of
communist revolution in Germany. Before.
Basically, a very rich culture of socialism that lasted like 100 years prior.
Karl
Marx was obviously
in Germany
from
when he did his writing.
So as soon as they contested power in Germany, and as soon as they became a legitimate threat in Germany, what happened? Hitler took over. He couped the government,
right, but
and he immediately sent them to the concentration
We're not going to pretend like that Hitler was an example of anything like he has his own ideology, and that's national.
Okay,
national socialism.
Okay,
that's not the ideology behind the United States or Britain necessarily. So we can't pretend like Hitler is simply an extreme example of the United States.
Yes, because there has never been a significant power grab by communists in the United States. The second that happens in the United States,
there's never been a successful one. I think there have been attempts.
And not anything like we've seen in other countries. The second that there is a legitimate communist threat against the United States is going to immediately be at least as authoritarian.
Communism is a lot more unpopular in the United States than it is in many other countries.
Yes, because of significant propaganda propped up to.
Well, maybe I think that our culture is very individualistic, whereas Chinese culture is rather collectivist anyway, and it always has been. And so, even though Marxism comes from Germany, it's not a Chinese belief. It's somewhat compatible with Chinese culture because they're not strong individualistic people like Americans are.
I actually reject your thinking on that. Marxism isn't necessarily a German ideology.
Well, it comes from the German language and location.
Right. Well, basically, what's the theory behind Marxism-Leninism is that you shouldn't follow okay, this is what you do. That's step one, and then step two. You need to you can't just copy and paste one thing.
Marx has theories about the history of economics, and then he has beliefs about how an economy should be run.
Yeah, but you can't just copy and paste the situation in the USSR and apply it to every country in the world.
Right,
you're going to have to
demographics and geography and all that. Of course.
You're going to have to make a Marxist. That's why they call it socialism with Chinese characteristics.
Right,
because
it's not orthodox Marxism. And in North Korea, they don't call it Marxism-Leninism; they call it Juche. Although obviously the Kim dynasty was installed by Stalin, and it is a communist country, but is a Juche country. I think
that's another good example. That's another good example of communists posing a threat to the power balance and capitalists funding a dictatorship. South Korea was a military dictatorship.
But notice how when the economy there was this economist Friedrich Hayek who was Austrian and fought in the First World War for Austria, and then when the Germans annexed Austria, the Nazis marched in. They burned all of his books, and he fled the country to go to Britain. He wasn't Jewish, but a lot of his associates were, because they had created a school of economics in Vienna, where they promoted extremely free market ideas. It's almost like the opposite of communism. But it was hated by the Germans because it was, first of all, it was viewed as Jewish. The Germans judged both Bolshevism and capitalism to be Jewish, essentially.
Yeah.
They did. They blamed Jews for both, and they destroyed the school in Vienna, which then eventually moved to the United States and London. But so Friedrich Hayek wrote a book in English in Britain in 1944, which sold out because they had paper shortages. It was very popular. It was called The Road to Serfdom, and essentially he's making the argument that in order to have a dictatorship or a totalitarian country like Nazi Germany or like Soviet Union, a very important and necessary step is government managing the economy, and that it's harder for a dictatorship to form where there's no government central planning of the economy, and so he promoted a small government with laissez-faire capitalism, but it's like something you would hear from Adam Smith or an Enlightenment era thinker, where it believes in essentially the classical liberalism. So in opposition to a continental philosophy like Nazism, nothing about Nazism is original. Fascism was created by Mussolini.
Yes.
And that was modified by Hitler. But Italian fascism was not the same as Nazism, which was essentially largely speaking, a racial theory.
Yeah.
But Germans, the Nazis, they borrowed a lot of ideas from kinds of philosophers from continental Europe. But the Austrian school is more in line with what you'd see in Britain or the United States philosophically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but
the Nazis hated Marx, but they also hated Enlightenment values like the United States Constitution, that sort of constitutional government, democracy, parliamentarianism.
Yes. But I mean, you said for me to just basically ignore Nazi Germany because that was like a one-time
Well,
thing.
no, you can use Nazi Germany. It's just keep
As
in
an
mind
example
that
of a power
it's
imbalance.
not politically the same ideology as the United States or as some other economic theorists who may be pro-capitalist.
I mean, and you're talking about the Austrian school. The Austrian
Yes.
school significantly believes that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the government needs to exist if to protect property rights. Now,
I think that they believe that the government, like, they're what I would call like well, they're essentially, there are these two economic schools that are not Keynesian economics, but they're still pro-capitalist, but they're much more libertarian, much more anti-government.
are you referring
So
to
there's
the Chicago
School of
Yeah,
Economics.
Chicago.
That's Milton Friedman's the Chicago School of Economics. That came from the United States.
Which is
But the
actually what
Austrian school comes from Vienna.
Which is actually what Pinochet got his economic policy.
Right,
off
that's
of, the
true.
Chicago
That's true.
boys.
However, like, you can't blame. I'll tell you about that. That's interesting. So you can't really blame Milton Friedman for what Pinochet did.
Oh, I know. I would not know. I don't blame.
Yeah, because remember, Milton Friedman was like a 5'6" Jew, like an economist. He's a fucking nerd. Okay, he's not gonna like. Yeah, he wasn't responsible for the military dictatorship.
Oh,
And
I'm
also,
aware.
the military dictatorship killed maybe 3,000 or 4,000 people in 20 years. Not quite the same number of bodies you'd see in Cuba or anywhere else, but not to excuse it. But
no, I'm aware.
So this is important. Milton Friedman actually said this. Milton Friedman said that having economic freedom and having a free market is a necessary but not sufficient condition to have a free society. What he means is you could have a free market and have a military dictatorship like Chile, but you could also have a free market and have a democratic country. And so he says that it's necessary to have a democratic country because you can't give the government too much power. But if it's a military dictatorship, obviously it will be a dictatorship. I think we can explain this by thinking about the political spectrum in two dimensions. It has a social axis of social policy, like authoritarianism on one end,
Yes,
and
yes.
libertarianism on the other. And then there's an economic axis, the x-axis, which is
Left and right axis. Yep.
exactly. And so bottom right quadrant would be Austrian school and the Chicago school. Top right quadrant would be Pinochet. Top left would be Mao. Bottom left would be maybe other socialists who are maybe softer.
Rojava or Catalonia, like
Maybe
anarchist
like
Catalonia.
maybe Nelson Mandela was like Nelson Mandela could fit in that probably.
But back to what I was saying. Okay, so you do admit that a necessary prerequisite of having a state is property rights. That is a good thing that the state does.
Well,
like,
I think
the state
that,
needs
yes,
to
yes.
exist
I
in
think
order
that the libertarians like Milton Friedman and Austrians will go.
All right.
Well, some of the extreme ones believe in anarcho-capitalism.
Yeah.
They don't believe in having a centralized state.
Yeah.
I don't believe in this. I think it's not. I think that some state is necessary, but most libertarians believe that government's necessary for a military, foreign policy, diplomacy, and also like a court system to enforce contracts and punish criminals and that sort of thing. But they want to limit the government to that and not have them micromanaging people's lives and that.
Yes, which I really think that helps my case because if you have, and I think we can use your own logic against you, if we have a system where a state is required to protect property rights, and you have a growing amount of people that want to violate the current form of property rights, which is capitalist ownership of the means of production, then you will. Logically, the extension of logic would be that you need to resort to military dictatorship in order to repress said people who are trying to disturb the property rights of the capitalists.
Well, not necessarily. I mean,
We've seen that in basically every country where it's been
democracy.
tried. There have been workers' rebellions in Saudi Arabia, but the Saudi monarchy was propped up by the United States. The
But remember,
second,
in a libertarian
in literally
country,
any country that we have seen in the world, the second that
control over society.
in literally any country that have seen in the entire world where there has been a significant communist movement or socialist movement, it has resorted to authoritarianism to try to squash it, even if they are completely peaceful.
Yes, that's generally true. But keep in mind that it's very rare for socialism about through an election. It's usually done through an insurrection. So only
Yes,
the only
because-
real exception would be in Chile, where the socialist leader got 35% of the vote, but de facto he won. He was elected.
Well, because electoralism is a farce in capitalism. I don't believe it's
What is it?
it's legitimate. I don't believe it's legitimate. It's I think
What
it's
is
a
it?
farce.
What, elections?
Elections in capitalist countries, yes.
Well, do you think that socialist countries should have elections then?
Okay, like I said before, every single country needs its own version of socialism. I
Well,
understand.
what if we make a generalization? Should socialist countries have a multi-party democracy and a constitution that's not a one-party state?
Okay, a prerequisite to this question, I'm going to answer it, but in order to bring socialism to America, we need to think of, I am an American. I do not want to bring socialism with Chinese characteristics. I don't want to bring
60% of the American people say they don't want a communist. Would you still advocate seizing their property, giving it to the state?
And that is a very interesting point you actually bring up, because
this
many
will
people
absolutely include many working class people and people currently on welfare, which is not Marxism, but it's certainly government handouts. I'm sure many of them still would rather have maybe some welfare states without having a Marxist-Leninist system.
But what I am saying is, I know that Americans will want a libertarian. I know that they are very individualistic people. So I do not want to force upon them a prior system. Like many communists do this, and I don't agree with it. The Communist Party of the U.S. Famously jokingly called when we have the revolution, it's going to call it the USSA, the United States of Soviet America. And the Soviet Union.
I mean, I don't think the average. Like,
Soviet,
I think that's. It seems like I live in a town, 95% white, educated. It's probably 55% Democrat. I'm in a solidly blue state.
Right.
But there are more Republicans here, maybe because it's richer and white.
Right.
But I've noticed that there are a lot of white leftists here, but they're very rich. So they're rich. Parents are educated. They're educated. They all have graduate degrees. They're white leftists. Yep. But then when you go into like Philadelphia or Camden, New Jersey, admittedly, many of the African Americans there, they are left-wing, or they're whatever. Maybe they're black nationalists, which could be a form of right-wing politics. But the ordinary working-class people, white or black or Latino, they're far less left-wing than some of the people in my town. I think it's because the people in my town have gone to university. So they've learned about these ideas, and maybe the working-class people, they have not gone to university. So they're not exposed to these ideas, but certainly, most of the Marxist-Leninists I've met have been white and college-educated and affluent, maybe upper middle class.
Yes, and that is, I would mainly say that is because of our educational system.
Yeah, it's probably because
I would argue
also,
that they do not accurately teach Marxism for obvious reasons, but I wouldn't even say that they teach what capitalism is. I think that the narrative in the educational system and just in general, obviously decades and decades of I'm not trying to diss on conservatives, just conservatives that are older. A lot of my family's conservative, but if you just talk to them, and I don't know if you cringe at it too as a right winger, but
there are some things
just,
I want to say that my political views are sort of idiosyncratic. Like I think I say things that piss off right-wing people as well, because I tolerate gays, that sort of thing, and also I believe. I believe.
Well, if you just listen to them talk, though, it's just like with Bernie Sanders. I think we can all agree that Bernie Sanders isn't a hardcore Marxist-Leninist. But if you hear boomers talk on the internet, they're like
Bernie Sanders is more far left than any candidate we've ever had, and he was a Marxist, and he probably still is a somewhat of a Marxist. Although I think he has, he's not a full-blown communist, but He used to use Che Guevara's slogan when signing letters, and he was a member of something called the Socialist Workers' Party, which is Trotskyist. So I would classify him as a far leftist, but I wouldn't by American political standards.
Yeah, but I think we can all agree
notice how
that
black voters voted for Biden overwhelmingly. So Biden got the nomination. White Democrats voted for Bernie. Black Democrats voted for Biden, and Biden essentially has now won.
But I think we can all agree that when boomers talk about there's going to be executions in Central Park if Bernie Sanders comes to power.
That's actually
decades of Cold War propaganda.
I don't think it's.
I think we can both agree that decades of Cold War propaganda have just completely rotted out.
Hang on now. I don't think that Bernie would necessarily have people executed in Central Park, but Fidel Castro and Che Guevara would. And I think that boomers who lived through the 60s and 70s, they're using experiences they learned from the Cold War, observing these communist countries. There are mass executions. It's justifiable to say that there would be executions. There always are.
But like, I mean, but I don't think we can just go ahead and like, what I'm trying to say is that their brains are basically completely rotted from decades
Well, no,
of Cold War propaganda.
they're just anti-communist because they're against the authoritarianism aspect of it.
I know, but they're just like they blatantly emotional reactions to the second that anyone even mentions the word socialist. And like, I don't see
that's true.
I don't see that from a lot of like millennial.
The reason why I'm like that is
conservatives.
because I associate socialism with either dictatorship or poverty or extreme oppression, like extreme oppression. Like, you've read the book One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, yes? I'm sure every Russian has heard of it, certainly.
Wait, what is it?
The writer's name is Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And he
the
lived
anti-Semite?
Well, he was an anti-Semite, but this book is not about Jews. I agree with you, he was an anti-Semite, but and he supported Putin, and I don't agree with that. But he wrote a book about the Soviet prison system, and he spent years in the Soviet prison system.
Yeah, it was literally a fictional book.
Irrelevant about that. It's just about the Soviet prison.
It was literally a fictional book, though.
No, that's the Ivan Denisovich book. That's a fictional book, but it was.
Oh no, Solzhenitsyn, the Gulag Archipelago. No, that was literally fiction. I mean, you can ask.
No, that's not fiction.
Yeah, you can ask his wife. If you ask his wife, and there was a New York Times article.
The KGB attempted to assassinate him.
Oh no,
they walked up to him in a department store.
Oh no, I'm not going to say that.
They poisoned him with an umbrella which had a needle in it to try to kill him.
Oh no, I'm not going to say that he was not in the gulags. I'm saying that everything in his book is literal fiction.
You're right. The Ivan Denisovich book was fiction, but it's certainly historical fiction.
Alexander Solzhenitsyn. No, I'm talking about Gulag Archipelago.
Yes,
Solzhenitsyn's
I've
wife.
read the book. That's a very long book, and it contains a lot of details about what it's like, how the process works when you are a prisoner.
Yes, however, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's wife.
They certainly mixed in political prisoners. They mixed in political prisoners with common criminals like rapists and murderers. And going to one of these gulags, essentially a death sentence, because you're not going to get any real medical care or food. You could
during the war.
Alexander
Solzhenitsyn, number one, Alexander Solzhenitsyn was there during the war times. I don't think we can.
Yes, he fought in World War II.
When the United States, when Germany literally invaded the USSR, killed 27 million people. I don't think that
big war.
We can say that is like the everyday condition of the gulag. I don't think that you can like realistically.
Yeah, I mean that was the most brutal war in history, but certainly the gulags preceded the Nazi invasion, and they occurred afterwards as well.
Yes, but if you genuinely listen to historians talk about, the gulags after the Stalin, I mean, Khrushchev significantly defunded them, and towards the end of the war, or towards the end of the Soviet Union,
I agree with you.
When they were liberating the gulags.
By the 1970s, I think that by the 1970s, the rate of incarceration was way down under Stalin, but that doesn't mean that there was no incarceration. And remember,
I'm aware.
If you are charged with a crime, in the Soviet Union, you don't have the same legal rights as you do in the United States.
I'm aware.
They can detain you without a trial indefinitely, for any reason.
Oh, I know.
And like I said, you don't have Fourth Amendment rights or Fifth Amendment rights. So,
and I do not agree with
Amendment
that.
Rights,
you
have no Fourth Amendment rights, so the police can search you without a warrant, even when there's no suspicion, and that's why they do wiretaps. And you have no Fifth Amendment rights, which means if they want you to confess, they will torture you until you sign a forced confession. It's not like in the United States where you have the right not to give evidence that incriminates you, right?
Right. I do not agree with
important legal differences.
Right. I do not agree with that. If somebody is doing that, I do not agree that they should be doing that.
It's not a matter of opinion. It's a matter of historical record.
Oh, no. I'm not disagreeing that it happened.
Even in Russia today, they still don't have the same political.
Oh, no, I think you misunderstand my point. I'm not saying that I disagree that it happened. I'm saying that I agree that is a bad thing.
Yeah,
and I would not want that.
I think that it's because they had a one-party state. No, they gave the Communist Party power over the court system and police, which is it's crazy. Like in China, they have the People's Liberation Army, which is
all comes back
controlled
to
by the Communist Party. It's not even technically the military; it's controlled by the party apparatus. It would be like if the Republican Party had a military in the United States.
It's all because of a power imbalance. The USSR wanted to remain in power, and if you actually read about so Hitler, not Hitler, but the person who was sent to go to Czechoslovakia to make a peace deal with the Soviet with Czechoslovakia from Germany. He said, what can we do to get a peace deal, whatever. And the prime minister, or whatever, Czechoslovakia said, "Oh, okay, we'll make some negotiations." Well, months pass, and
was this 1938?
I don't know what year it was, but so months pass.
Was it like before the war, though?
Yes. So months pass, and the ambassador, or whatever, of Germany said, "Okay, Czechoslovakia, no deal." And Czechoslovakia is like, okay, why? Like, what's up? So basically what happened is the German ambassador said, well, we have reason to believe that there will be a power differential in the USSR, and the only reason that we wanted a peace deal with you is, basic geopolitical nonsense.
Right, they had the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in, I believe, 1938.
So we did, yes.
Where the Germans and Russians agreed to carve up Eastern Europe. So secretly, the Germans and Russians met, and they drew a line through Eastern Europe where the Baltic states and Eastern Poland, which are all independent, 4 different independent countries, these are all given to the Soviet Union by Germany, and then Western Poland, most of Poland was given to Germany. And so then when Germany invaded Poland, Russia was expecting this because they had already carved up Eastern Europe, but Russia believed that Germany wouldn't attack them. So a few weeks after the Germans invaded Poland, the Soviets invaded from the other end. Then they executed 30,000 Polish army officers in the Katyn forest. They used German ammunition and pistols, Walther P-38 pistols.
Okay, I'm going to get to that later. I will contest that point
but then
later. But
they invaded 4 sovereign countries: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. And then they invaded Finland, so 5 sovereign countries. Later, they invaded Czechoslovakia and Hungary. That's 7 sovereign countries. So,
okay, I will refute that.
Do you think the Soviet aggression is justifiable?
Okay, I will refute that in a second. But basically, what I was talking about is, we know now, due to historical evidence, that he was talking about Trotsky, the German ambassador who was trying to make this deal. We know now that Trotsky and the Great Purges that killed about 700,000
yes, Trotsky
people in the USSR.
was a rival of Stalin. Overseas.
We now know that there was a coup attempt in the USSR, and the Trotsky faction of the government was aligned with the Nazi Germany. So I would say that is justified.
That is. They seem like a communist government.
I mean, so you can go ahead and say, oh, Trotskyism isn't Marxism, Leninism, so I don't agree with it. But
well,
you can
don't
go
you
ahead.
think that
I would say it's justified.
Like the way a religious person. It sounds like the way a religious Muslim would say that I'm Sunni, so Shia is not real Islam. That's because of like an ecumenical difference. It's not because it's not Islam, just because there's a disagreement, right?
Oh no,
couldn't you admit that it's still Trotskyism is still communist? It's just not the ideology that you follow. Like when I was following leftist political views when I was younger, I liked the ideas of Emma Goldman and I liked the ideas of Peter Kropotkin, but I didn't like the ideas of Chairman Mao or Stalin. So like that was a clear ideological distinction. But I still recognize that as communist, I viewed myself as a follower of more of an anarchist communist philosophy.
Oh no,
I'm
sorry. I think you misunderstand me. I'm not saying that it's not socialism. I'm saying that
it's still communism, which is not ideologically.
Yeah, it's not Marxism, Leninism. I wouldn't expect you to defend Nazi Germany simply because I know that is not your ideology, so I can't necessarily.
I'm not like
defend Trotskyism.
I think that like a lot of the criticisms, like I have some special criticisms for Nazi Germany that I don't apply to Soviet. But I think a lot of criticisms I apply to Nazi Germany are the same ones I apply to the Soviet Union because lack of individual freedom, lack of civil rights, mass murder, that sort of thing, being belligerent.
No, but specifically referring to the deaths in the Soviet Union and all that, I would say that you can go ahead and say 700,000 people, that's way too much.
Well, we don't know the exact numbers, and I don't think that anyone in Russia does exactly either. But we have a rough idea, or some numbers.
Right-wingers like Timothy Snyder, like historians like Timothy Snyder, typically say that there's about 700,000, give or take. You can never really know the true number.
Actually,
I would
sounds
say that
correct
it is.
To me. I read a figure that the Soviet Union executed about 1 million people during the 20s and 30s.
But I would say that it
sounds correct. I don't know. That doesn't include people who starved to death with government action, though. So the actual death toll probably was mostly caused by forced starvation. And,
yes, however, I would say that the repression and purges, giving the historical context of the war at the time and the fact that there was a major concern that there would be a coup attempt, justifies the fact that there were purges. Now, I understand that they did persecute Stalin. The thing that I disagree with in Stalin was he executed many loyal Bolsheviks. He executed many people who were loyal Bolsheviks
to the inner circle.
Yes. So I disagree with a lot of the people that he actually did execute. However, I would say that the purges, specifically the things to wipe out Trotskyist sentiment in the government that could have led to.
Well, is it acceptable to murder people who because in the United States, if someone has an opinion you don't agree with, like you're a communist, for example, I'm on the political right. Like I'm not going to create a right-wing dictatorship that's going to go Pinochet on you and kill you. I don't think that's like.
Oh no, I'm
I
saying.
with you. I believe in like freedom of speech.
Oh no, I'm saying in this.
Like, you know.
Oh no, I'm saying in this specific historical context, given the fact that Trotsky was aligned with Hitler in World War II, and the fact that if the USSR were knocked out of the,
I don't know,
and given the fact that the USSR took out, given the fact that the USSR was the one who took out Nazi Germany, I'm pretty sure that, given the historical context, you would agree that the fact that they repressed this basically led to the USSR saving World War II from the Nazis.
Well, maybe, but like, what's the point? Like, what is the
wait. So I'm confused. So if somebody is trying to coup the government, do you think that they should just like be allowed to coup it, or would you blame them for trying
when do the ends finally not justify the means? Like, how many people do you like? If you what number of people killed and murdered? Do you agree that the ends don't justify the means? Like you say, we're killing all these people and invading all these countries to protect us from Germany, but at what point is the medicine worse than the cure? You know, I mean. Well,
yeah, exactly. I could ask you the exact same thing simply because well, would you support a coup attempt on your government? Just checking.
Well, no, but then again, like when has the United States executed 30,000 foreign? Like when has the United States invaded a foreign country? Unprovoked, Poland in this case, and executed 30,000 army officers, and then dug a mass grave and dumped them there.
There's significant evidence that was there. Okay, so you're saying that it was the USSR.
Yes, and this was revealed. This was revealed by KGB documents in like 1990, and it was.
Okay. So no, I would contest that simply because Khrushchev was significantly anti-Stalinist, and that came out during Khrushchev's time.
Well, it's well known that the cut-in done by NKVD.
Well known. It's really contested. It's contested historically.
Well,
like, there's not
it sounds like anytime you, like I don't know. I mean, there's physical evidence, like the dead bodies. It wasn't the Soviet part of Poland.
Not only that, why as soon as the USSR invaded Poland, or they didn't invade Poland, they took up the area of Poland.
Yes, they did. Poland was a sovereign country. It was invaded by Germany.
No, it was not.
The Russians invaded later.
No, it was not. The Russians invaded after Poland had already fallen.
Invaded? What do you call it then? Poland didn't want Russia to come in.
Oh, definitely not. Oh, yeah, yes, they did actually, because the Polish officers
and they were illegally
and there are several reasons to suggest that it actually was not an invasion. And
what
it
about
actually
refutes Finland?
And it actually kind of refutes your point that the Katyn massacre is what you're referring to with the execution of the officers. The head officers of the Polish army let the USSR come in, and they said, "Hey, don't attack these people." And then they had a pact with Romania. Poland had a pact with Romania, like a non-aggression pact, a military alliance, and they said, "Hey, Romania, do not invade." And literally no country on earth at the time recognized that it was an invasion. And do you know why it was? And do you know why it was not considered an invasion?
They invaded Finland.
And yes, they did invade Finland. But
what's the difference? Because it seems like Poland was also a sovereign country, and also there were 3 Baltic states that were also invaded.
It was not Poland was not a sovereign country at that time.
Yes, it was. Poland was a sovereign country after the Treaty of Versailles.
Yes, after the Treaty of Versailles, but the Nazi Germany had already invaded and taken the capital.
The Germans had been removed from parts of East Prussia. The Treaty of Versailles, and that's why Germany invaded.
I'll set up the context, and I guess I'll say why I justify you call it an invasion. I'd say that it was not an invasion.
Well, you can change the terminology of what it is, but that's just it's kind of obfuscating the truth. It was absolutely an invasion.
So they filled in the area. That's what I would call it with military. They used it as a buffer zone.
What would happen if the United States sent its military into Canada, for example, without permission of the Canadian government?
Okay, I will tell you the difference. So, given the context of World War II. You have the USSR basically has no friends.
Like, for example, the British and Americans invaded Iceland during World War II to justify protecting the Germans.
Let's take the context of the World War II, okay? So the USSR basically has no friends. The United States.
Well, we did give them Lend-Lease in
the United
1941,
States,
42, 43, 44.
the United States, Britain, France. Britain is literally on record of saying, okay, let's just try to provoke the Nazis to invade the USSR.
I mean, I talked to a leftist maybe yesterday. Maybe you saw this. It was in that group. I talked to a leftist who argued that the Soviet Union and the United States were actually not enemies. There was a conspiracy. This is crazy. I don't think you believe this, but
No.
she believed that both countries had a conspiracy to be rivals as a way to get an excuse to do domestic policy on their people. And I argue that there's no evidence for this. They were actually enemies, and they would do whatever they wanted to people anyway. But I don't think she was amenable to reason.
Yeah, just like the Nazi,
That seems,
the Holocaust denier.
You at least have some political theory. I disagree with you. You have some political theory behind what you're saying. What she's saying is just plain false. Like, yes, they were enemies.
Yes, I'm an atheist, actually, and how I came to my political ideology, I think that I should only believe something if I have some evidence for it. Now, obviously, I'm not
I actually
perfect.
agree with you there. I'm also secular. Like, I've never, my family never had religion growing up. Like, my uncle, my mother's brother, was a Catholic monk. And he could read like biblical Hebrew and Latin, and I didn't know him well. But so parts of my family were very religious, but like I never grew up with religion, was never baptized, and I was always an atheist, even when I was like 11 years old. And so I liked Marxism as a kid because I thought it was like, oh, it's secular. But now I realize it's like I might be an atheist, but I don't want to force other people not to have religion. It's like I disagree with them, and I also think that things like the Catholic Church or any religion, I think they shouldn't have political power. And there should be separation of church and state. And I don't want religious people to take away my liberties.
Communism believes in separation of church and state. China is a secular government. It's not an atheist government.
I agree with the secularist aspect of communism, but I don't agree with the persecution of Christians. Like in Soviet Union or North Korea, even if you have a Bible, that's the offense. You can be put in a prison for that.
No, you can't. I'll tell you a really good documentary. Watch the propaganda. I don't know if it's still on Netflix. The propaganda games. They actually go into a church in North Korea, and there are people celebrating, worshiping.
I don't think you can. I don't think you can believe. Like most footage and things from North Korea are theater. It's not real. Like their government. In order to
Do you have any evidence for this?
Well, their government is clearly very very much lying. Like for example, there is a Potemkin village. Potemkin village is it's a fake town which the North Koreans have built across the DMZ from South Korea, and the South Korean soldiers can observe it. But if you actually go into it, it's just empty concrete buildings with no electricity, with no people living in them.
Yes, they said the exact same thing about China, and now we know that they are trying to build modern cities. They call them ghost cities.
Well, that's what I mean when I say that.
That's
actually a really good example of what I mean when I say that when the government is in control of all projects, it leads to unnecessary waste. So, for example, they'll build a building project that, like for example, in North Korea, there's the largest building in North Korea is this giant concrete hotel that never opened, and they ran out of money to complete it. It's just a huge fucking wasteful project. Cost them a huge amount of money, and they could never finish it. So it's not productive. You see things like this in socialism and not capitalism, because if a business is losing money in capitalism, they take their capital and they liquidate that business and they invest in something that does make money because they want that profit. But under socialism, you might not even know when you're losing money because the prices are all fixed.
Yes, and that is the biggest concern I have with capitalism is they invest in something only if it is profitable. I think that humanity is way more capable. I think that humanity is way more capable.
I have many friends. Who are very far left wing, and they make the same criticism of capitalism.
Well, me personally, I think that we should.
Here's my argument to counter that, though. Do you think that, I think that in the United States and in the Soviet Union, people are equally greedy just because greed is an aspect of human nature. However, the difference is that in the United States, because we have a profit-based economic system, if you're greedy and you want to make money, you have to produce something that the public wants. You must provide something of value to the public in order to get rich in the United States.
And if you don't have money, you don't get it.
Right,
we have more than enough.
We have more than
enough housing. We have more than enough housing to put every single homeless person in a house, but they don't have money, so they can't get housing.
The reason why we
have enough food in the entire world to ensure that. We have enough food to ensure that everybody in the United States gets something to eat.
I agree with you, but like I said,
okay, so like the billions of people or like the millions of people who have died from starvation, even though the fact that we have enough
most of the famines in the 20th century were in communist countries. So that doesn't really make
India?
sense.
India, like
Well,
the
it's
death
happening
toll
in
of
India and
India,
other places as well.
like the
Remember,
death toll in
India has
India,
a socialist government.
the death toll of India alone eclipses the amount of people who
Well,
died in total in the United.
I'm not sure what the
in all
numbers are, but I
socialist
know the
countries.
Chinese famine was the worst famine of the 20th century. But what I wanted to say is that
India had literally
yes,
a
there's
continuous
homelessness- yes,
famine
there's-
for
yes,
centuries.
there's homelessness,
essentially.
and there is homelessness in the United States. But if you go look around the homeless people in Philadelphia, where I live, mostly they're homeless because of drug addiction and mental health problems. Now, this is a real problem. We should solve it, and it's not being solved.
Which is why we should
not
have
because-
socialized health care.
Well, yeah, okay, that's one argument that could be made, but
I mean, actually, that supports my argument perfectly. I mean, these people cannot afford
but hang on
help.
now.
These people cannot
What if-
afford help, and
the United
in
States,
socialist
you're allowed
countries,
to choose. In the United States, you're allowed to choose where you want to live. In Russia, you don't have the freedom to choose in Soviet Union where you
so I
want
can
to live.
live.
And in
So,
China,
wait
you
a
also
minute.
don't.
So I can live in like so like a black person, if he really wanted to, like a poor black person who has like basically no chance of getting like a good. He doesn't have a good education.
Well,
like he can go live in
I would blame
Beverly
the government
Hills.
for that.
So he can
I
go live in
think that
Beverly
the
Hills.
government's responsible. The government's responsible for educating inner city black people, and if they're failing to do that, it could be because we've
Wait,
trusted
no,
the
they're
government
not.
to do something that they
No, they're
shouldn't
not.
be
The
doing.
the black communities are expected to school themselves. Oh, in the United States, I'm sure you would agree
Well,
to this.
we have
the
schools with black students.
we have the barbaric system of expecting neighborhoods to choose the education system, which
Well, I don't know. I agree with you. I don't know if we should have public schools based on
me
property
personally,
taxes.
I grew up in a really good area in central Ohio, and we had a very good school system. One of the best
same
for
with
my
me.
area.
I went to a
However,
good
if
school.
you
I went to
have
a very good school.
if you have a people who are historically repressed, they didn't even get to vote fairly until about 70 years ago. They were significantly repressed up until about the 60s, and they still were, even till today, if you look at the statistics. And then you say,
Well,
okay, now
when I say
these people
that
who have
there's-
been in poverty for generations now have to school themselves. I would say that is a problem.
They don't have to school themselves. They do go to public schools. But what I wanted to say
Public
is
schools that is funded
any
with-
person is free to any
by
American
neighborhood
citizen
taxes.
is free to buy a house. Any American citizen is indeed free to buy a house in my town. if
Yes,
they
they're-
want to
they're
live
free
here.
to buy a
And
house.
They can leave. Well, you
They're
need to
free
have the
to-
money. You can't steal the money. You have to. Maybe you can.
They're free
You're
to
not
buy a
supposed
house in the United
Yes.
States wherever they want to if they have the money. If they do not have the money, then
Exactly.
fuck them.
Right, but in the Soviet Union, you had to only in the Soviet Union, whether you had the money or not made no difference. In Soviet Union, you were given the apartment the government said you could have, and for the most part, in the Soviet Union, most families lived in shared apartment flats where maybe 2 or 3 families would share one big apartment. We had like
In
private
the
area,
beginning,
like
in the
common area.
I would say in the beginning of the USSR, yes, they took the aristocracy.
Well, they have a lot of tenement buildings and apartment buildings. It's like ugly concrete apartment buildings instead of like freestanding houses and that sort of thing.
Now you're dissing brutalist architecture. Okay.
Well, you would admit, even if you're a communist, you'd admit that the Stalinist architecture is quite ugly. Like look at East Germany in particular, because East Germany was bombed so much and they rebuilt it. Architecturally speaking, it's quite ugly. All the medieval buildings are gone.
Oh no! This is just an aside, obviously, but I absolutely love brutalist architecture. I mean, you could just type in. That's what it's called, by the way, brutalist architecture. Look, there are actually some pretty fascinating.
Well, I like architecture that's aesthetically pleasing to me. I don't know how subjective I am, but I think most people would agree with me that some of the modernist architecture is a bit distasteful compared to more traditional forms of architecture. But this is my opinion. It's sort of a values judgment, not a fact.
Talking about homelessness in the United States, and we started with China, so I guess I'll circle it all back around. Is China actually has a larger portion of people with homes than the United States. The same with Cuba.
But like I said, you know that in China there's a hukou system. So the hukou system, essentially, it's an internal passport system. So if you want to live and work in Beijing or Shanghai, it's very difficult to get a hukou to move and live in one of these places. If you move as a migrant worker, you don't have any legal, you don't have many legal rights or access to services if you move within the country. I mean, America restricts the movement of illegal immigrants, but they're not citizens of the country. Citizens of the country are free to move around. They're free to travel on the highway system and take domestic flights. In China, you're not free to move freely. So if you want to move to a different city, or you have to marry someone from that city, or you need to be in the Communist Party and know someone. And it's like the Communist Party It's a two-tiered society.
People move
where
wait. People
there's
move
the
around in
ordinary
China.
people, and there's people who are in the Communist Party. And
People move
who are
around in
the
China all
Communist
the
Party
time.
have better housing, better food, better everything.
People move around in China all the time. Like, one of the biggest criticisms against China is the Bingtuan in the Xinjiang province, where a bunch of Han are going to basically industrialize the western part of the country, which is significantly more impoverished. So yeah, a bunch of people can
Most of the
actually go.
economic developments on the East Coast.
So a bunch of people, like, and you said there were a bunch of Uyghurs in the Beijing. Like, a bunch of, it sounds like a bunch of people can actually move
they've
around.
moved, but some of them are migrant workers who can't get formal jobs, and so they work in the informal economy. It's like they're in Beijing, but they're technically not allowed to live or work there, but they do anyway in violation of the law. It's almost like being an illegal immigrant, but except it's in their own country. So there's a bit of a difference there, a pretty extreme difference, in fact.
So
Also, in all communist countries, they give, the capital city is where, they'll give Communist Party members and skilled workers nice apartments, good food, good schools for their kids in, like, nice capital city. And then there are peasants who are really the underclass, who are more in the countryside. And in China in particular, there's a huge divide between rural areas and urban areas. And so when I was in Beijing, I was in Dongcheng, which is like a very booming business center. And it's very modern. I was there 10 years ago, but still. Then you leave Beijing, you go like 3 hours in the countryside, and you will see like they have people pooping in the streets, no running water, no flush toilets, that sort of thing. And so there's a huge economic divide between urban and rural. Now you made a point that housing is not. We have enough houses to house all the homeless. You're right, we do. But the housing problem is not because people are too poor to afford housing. It's because there's really a mental health problem and substance use problem. It's really a health issue.
Hold on.
A housing crisis. It's a health issue, I think.
Excuse me for 1 second. I'm trying to find the charger for my computer real quick. I'll be right back.
Oh, sure. But I think that if we just started putting homeless people in seized houses, there would be no incentive for builders to produce new houses. And also, if homeless people if we just began dumping all, like for example, we do Section 8 housing in the United States, which is a program with good intentions, but they end up putting all of the poor people in one housing project, which lends itself to crime. They also put all the fatherless homes in one place. What they should do is maybe if they did like a basic minimum income, or if they scattered the housing projects, it would not lead to multi-generational poverty. But these programs, they're well-intentioned, but maybe not good. And if you just begin seizing houses, no one will produce more of them. Like, they produce them because there's a profit to be made by selling the housing. Someone will get a mortgage and pay it. But if that can't happen, there's no incentive to produce more housing, and so it's just not produced. Like, for example, we have rent control in New York City and in San Francisco. But these are also the places with the highest rents in the United States. And in Philadelphia, they proposed rent control. And the intention seems good, because it's like, hey, what if a person can't afford rent? Well, we'll put a cap on it so these greedy landlords can't get it. But then landlords won't fix the house because they're not making money off of it. And more importantly, construction companies...
They're legally obliged to fix the house.
Well, the rent control is just like any other price control. Any price control does not allow the price to legally rise above the set rates, but the real value of a house might be much higher than the rent control. So the point is that if you don't let the price reflect supply and demand, it does result in shortages, including housing.
Yes, but that actually brings up another problem I have with the American housing system is Airbnb. The very reason for the specific rent control thing that you are talking about in New York City is Airbnb is now apartment buildings can just there are apartment complexes who rent out apartments basically like hotels. And
yes,
they can charge them significantly.
They'll do that if it's more profitable for them, for sure.
Yes, so that is driving up the rent in every city, in a major city in America. basically.
Yes,
so
it's
I would
also, think
argue
about it, though,
that
it's
market
also,
fluctuations in
it's also
general
bringing
are very
travelers. It's also bringing
inefficient.
travelers into the economy. It's bringing travelers into the economy who spend money, so that does increase economic growth and tax revenue. But you
Yeah,
make a good
economic
point to
growth
that.
doesn't necessarily mean that the people who have to get their rent increased benefit
Well,
from
I
it.
think what we're seeing now in Manhattan, is that poor people are essentially forced off of Manhattan. My sister lives in Hoboken, New Jersey, where rent is marginally cheaper than Manhattan, but not really, because it's right on the river. And like, I don't know why she chooses to live there, because I live in New Jersey. I can't fucking afford here.
Yeah, you're talking about
I want
gentrification.
to leave to go to Delaware, Pennsylvania. But yeah, New York is very expensive. But then again, here's what I mean. It is expensive, and that's not good. And there are things we can do, like we could allow the building of more housing in Manhattan.
Oh no, I'm saying
It's
that like
it's
because
small
of
island, we
market.
can't really build anymore. And
No, I'm saying because of market forces like
well, here's the
Airbnb
thing: it's like
and the.
socialism.
I'm saying because of Airbnb and
I think
the
that
increased.
socialism cannot legislate scarcity out of existence.
Yep, yeah. I would actually almost agree with that. With the level of technology we
There's
have
no more
right now,
room for
we can.
housing developments.
I'm sorry.
Well, I mean to say that in Manhattan, for example, the physical space and land in Manhattan is quite limited. They've really overdeveloped it, so it's very valuable to have land in Manhattan. So the land itself is extremely valuable. So we can't. There's also none left, and so we can't legislate more land into existence. We could get some Dutch people to come in and build a dike and make more islands. You could do that. I'm sure they have done that. But we can't legislate more housing into existence if the physical space is not there.
Yes, but we already have the houses to fit these homeless people, and the only thing
Well,
about the only thing about
I don't
actually
think that would solve the underlying problem.
actually housing
of
developments, at
health
least in
issues,
Columbus,
but it would
Ohio,
cause,
like throughout the United States, housing
well, for
developments
example,
are being.
like, if there were empty houses across the street from you, say 5 or 6 of them, would you want homeless people who are using heroin and fentanyl to move into those houses and then lower your property value? And then, like, I know we should provide housing somewhere, but would you want it to be?
Well, I don't believe that. I don't believe property values should fluctuate like that. So that's kind of a moot argument about socialism.
The property value is based on supply and demand, just like everything
in
else.
capitalism,
So,
but we're
it
talking
can
about my
change
ideal
based on
system.
the demand.
And it wouldn't really be a property
Like, for
fluctuation.
example, in Italy, they have way for €1.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I know about that. Japan
I have
too.
family in Italy, and like there, like in my family's village, my great grandfather left Italy over 100 years ago, but I still talk to the family there. In their village, the population's been shrinking for decades. First, because of people moving to the cities, and then because old country. And so
What do they live in
more people
South
die
Italy?
than are born, and so there are a lot of empty houses in Italy. So they'll give you one for €1 if you promise to live there and become part of the community. They're desperate to get. People. Point is that's an example of demand going down, and so the prices go down. You can also lower
Yes,
prices.
but isn't
by
that a
just increasing
government
the
program?
supply.
But isn't that a
In
government?
Manhattan, if we can't increase the supply of housing, we can
Yeah.
reduce the demand.
But the example
That
that
won't
you
happen
give,
because it's very profitable to use that land for office buildings and that sort of thing.
but the example that you give about isn't that a government program? Isn't that a good the reason that you just listed? Isn't that an example of
It is, but it's not. Maybe I'd say so, but they're not seizing property from people who are using it. Although, I don't know.
All right. It's been about 2 hours. Did you? My wife is telling me that she would like to sleep.
Sure, it was a nice chat with you, Andrew. I will be around.
That's amazing.
Just time. I go.
All right. You have a good night.
Oh, good.